Amara Lewis was only 19 when her life took a turn she never expected. Growing up in a small Florida town, she had dreams that reached beyond her surroundings. She wanted to study, travel, and build a life free from the struggles she had known since childhood. But dreams can be fragile things, easily broken by one wrong decision. For Amara, that decision came when she fell in with the wrong crowd, friends who promised excitement but led her down a road of poor choices and regret. One evening changed everything when she was caught in possession of illegal substances. The charge wasn't major, but it was enough to send her to prison. She told herself it would be temporary, a chapter she would close and never reopen. She believed she could rebuild her life once she got out. But she didn't know that prison would become the place where her greatest strength and deepest pain would meet. Inside those walls, Amara found herself surrounded by stories like her own, young women who had lost direction but still carried pieces of hope in their hearts. She joined programs, attended counseling sessions, and even began writing letters to herself about the woman she wanted to become. Her determination to change caught the attention of many, including one correctional officer named Daniel Pierce. He was older, quiet, and seemed to treat her differently from the others. At first, his kindness felt like safety. In a place where compassion was rare, a few gentle words could mean the world. But what began as encouragement soon crossed a dangerous line. Amara found herself trapped between fear and confusion, unable to escape the situation. The imbalance of power was clear: he was a guard, and she was an inmate. When she discovered she was pregnant, the weight of her reality crashed down like a storm. The news spread through the prison quickly, and with it came whispers, judgment, and shame. Amara was placed in isolation, told it was for her protection, though it felt more like punishment. The system that should have defended her instead turned away. The guard denied everything, and the officials buried the truth under paperwork. Still, even in isolation, Amara refused to give up. She started to write again, letters to her unborn child, pages filled with love, apology, and dreams. She named the baby Hope, a name that symbolized everything she still believed in. When Hope was born, Amara's spirit seemed to shine again. Her story began to reach the outside world, and advocacy groups took notice. Journalists wrote about her, and letters of support arrived daily. She began to believe that her pain could lead to purpose. She dreamed of working to help other women like her when she was finally free. But her hope was short-lived. Just 1 week before her scheduled release, Amara was found dead in her cell. Officials called it suicide, but those who knew her refused to believe it. Her plans, her letters, and her dreams told a different story. The truth was buried, but her legacy was not. Her daughter grew up surrounded by people who told her who her mother really was: a fighter, a survivor, and a woman whose voice sparked a movement. Amara's story became more than tragedy. It became a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope can still be born. The news of Amara Lewis's death spread quickly, stirring confusion and anger among those who had followed her story. To the officials, she was just another inmate whose case had closed, but to the women she had inspired and the advocates who had written to her, she was a symbol of resilience. Her name began to appear on social media, in local newspapers, and in community discussions across Florida. Questions surfaced: how could a woman who had spoken passionately about rebuilding her life suddenly end it all just days before freedom? The official report mentioned no signs of foul play, but small details didn't add up. Her letters stopped abruptly, her belongings were missing, and staff members who had spoken kindly of her were reassigned overnight. The silence surrounding her death spoke louder than any words could. People wanted answers, but inside the prison system, truth often moved slower than justice itself. Outside those walls, a local advocacy group named Second Dawn began investigating her story. They reached out to other inmates who had known her, gathering statements about her final weeks. The women spoke about how Amara had been anxious but determined, often talking about her plans for life after release. She wanted to build a program that helped young women transition from prison back into society. Her ideas were written in notebooks that vanished the same day she was found. Those missing pages became the heart of the growing mystery. Second Dawn pushed for a full investigation, demanding accountability from the prison administration. As media coverage grew, the Department of Corrections faced public scrutiny for the first time in years. They released a brief statement expressing condolences but avoided addressing the guard's involvement or the circumstances of her pregnancy. The words felt empty to those who had seen the truth unfold firsthand. Amara's daughter, Hope, was taken into foster care at first, but her story reached a retired social worker named Gloria Harris, who had followed Amara's journey since the beginning. Gloria fought for custody, believing that Hope deserved to grow up knowing her mother's real story, not the version hidden in reports. After months of legal struggle, Gloria became Hope's guardian, raising her in a home surrounded by memories of the woman who had fought so hard to give her life meaning. Each year, Gloria organized community events in Amara's name, using them to raise awareness about abuse and misconduct in correctional facilities. Slowly, Amara's legacy transformed from scandal to symbol. As years passed, Amara's name began to represent more than tragedy. She became the face of a movement demanding reform, her story taught in classrooms and discussed in community halls. Lawsuits were filed, and policy changes began to take root. Though the system never admitted fault, the shift was undeniable. Prisons across Florida started implementing stricter oversight, body cameras, and protections for female inmates. Amara had not lived to see it, but her story changed the lives of countless women who came after her. Through the persistence of strangers and the love of a child who bore her name's meaning, hope continued to rise from the ashes of injustice years past, and Amara Lewis's story refused to fade. What began as a tragedy whispered among inmates became a movement that challenged an entire system. Documentaries, articles, and social campaigns began to unravel the layers of neglect and corruption that had silenced her voice. Activists called it the Hope Movement, named after her daughter, who had now grown into a quiet but determined young girl. Raised by Gloria Harris, Hope grew up hearing about the mother she never got to meet. The stories painted Amara not as a victim, but as a fighter, a woman who had found courage even when the world tried to take it away. Every letter Amara had written was kept in a small wooden box in Gloria's living room. Hope read them often, her mother's words becoming a map of resilience guiding her through life. By the time Hope turned 16, she began to speak publicly about her mother's life and death. Her first appearance was at a local youth event in Miami, where she stood before a small crowd and told them that her mother's story was not about loss, but about strength. The speech went viral online. Viewers saw a young girl standing with confidence, her voice trembling yet powerful, echoing the message that one person's pain could become another's purpose. Soon after, national news outlets picked up her story, calling her the daughter of courage. Hope didn't seek fame, she only wanted the truth to matter. With the support of Second Dawn and a few dedicated journalists, Hope began collecting testimonies from other women who had suffered similar abuses inside prisons. Many had been too afraid to speak before, but seeing Amara's daughter take a stand gave them strength. Together, they created a campaign to push for new legislation protecting inmates from sexual misconduct and ensuring independent investigations into such cases. Lawmakers started paying attention. The same institutions that once ignored Amara's pleas were now forced to confront the consequences of their silence. Hope also visited schools and community centers, reminding young people that mistakes do not define a life. She spoke about redemption, forgiveness, and the importance of using one's voice even when it shakes. Her story reached beyond prisons, it became a message about resilience in every struggle. People began to see Amara not just as a tragic figure, but as a spark that ignited change. One evening, as Hope prepared to speak at a televised event, she opened her mother's final letter. It was short, written days before her death. Amara had written that she felt afraid, but she also believed that her story would one day save others. Those words became the closing line of Hope's speech that night. The audience stood in silence, tears streaming as her voice filled the room with strength and sorrow intertwined. What had begun in the shadows of a Florida prison had become a beacon for justice. Hope realized that her mother's name would never again be spoken as a headline of tragedy, but as a legacy of transformation that outlived every wall that once confined her. The movement that had begun with Amara's tragedy continued to grow stronger with every passing year. What started as a local call for justice turned into a national conversation about abuse, accountability, and reform. Across the country, people began to speak out against the silence that had protected those in power for too long. Documentaries were released, lawmakers debated new bills, and for the first time in years, the truth about the hidden world behind prison walls began to surface. Amara's name became a rallying cry for justice, but for Hope, it was something far more personal. She carried her mother's memory everywhere she went, feeling the weight of both love and expectation. Every interview, every speech, every public appearance reminded her that she was not just speaking for herself, but for all the women who never got the chance to be heard. Still, the attention was not without challenges. Some accused her of exploiting her mother's story for attention, while others doubted the truth of what had really happened. Old reports resurfaced, attempting to discredit Amara's name and rewrite the past. Hope learned quickly that justice was not only about facts but also about persistence. She refused to let her mother's story be buried under the same lies that had once silenced her. Instead, she worked harder, gathering allies, legal experts, and survivors who shared their experiences publicly. Slowly, her determination began to pay off. 5 years after her first public speech, a new law was passed in Florida known as the Amara Lewis Protection Act. It required all prisons to install surveillance in staff-only areas, mandated independent oversight for misconduct claims, and guaranteed medical and psychological support for victims of assault behind bars. The bill was named in Amara's honor, and Hope stood beside lawmakers as it was signed. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but in that moment, all she could think about was how her mother would have smiled to see the change she inspired. That night, Hope visited her mother's grave. The stone was simple, carved with a quote Amara had once written in her journal, "Even in darkness, I will reach for the light." Hope placed a single sunflower beside it, the flower her mother loved most. The air was quiet, the stars scattered above like tiny promises. She whispered that it was finally done, that her mother's fight had not been in vain. But deep down, Hope knew her work wasn't finished. There were still prisons where stories like her mother's were unfolding in silence. There were still women waiting to be believed. So she promised herself to continue, to keep telling their stories, to keep demanding change. What had begun as grief had grown into purpose. Hope had turned pain into power, proving that even the most broken beginnings could lead to the strongest endings. Amara's legacy lived not just in law, not just in memory, but in the lives of every woman who dared to dream of freedom again. Years later, the world had changed, though not completely. Progress moved slowly, but it was undeniable that Amara Lewis's story had left a permanent mark. Her name appeared in textbooks, her case studied in law schools as an example of how one person's suffering could shift an entire system. The Amara Lewis Protection Act became a model for other states to follow, and correctional facilities across the country began adopting similar reforms. For many, she had become a symbol of justice, but for Hope, she was still simply her mother, a woman she had never met but who had guided her entire life. Hope had grown into a calm, focused young woman with her mother's eyes and the same quiet fire that once burned in Amara's heart. She now worked full-time with Second Dawn, helping women transition from incarceration back into society. Every time she walked into a shelter or a halfway house, she felt her mother's presence in the air, reminding her that change was possible, even when it began in pain. Despite all she had achieved, Hope often felt the ache of what was missing. There were moments she wished she could have one conversation with her mother, to ask her how she kept faith when everything seemed lost. On difficult days, she would sit by the window with the old wooden box of letters and reread her mother's words. One line had always stayed with her, "Your life will be the proof that my story mattered." It became her personal mantra. Whenever doubt crept in, those words lifted her again. Hope decided to start a foundation in her mother's name, not just to continue the fight for prison reform, but to offer education, housing, and mental health support for women trying to rebuild their lives. The foundation grew rapidly, funded by donations from people who had been touched by Amara's story. Former inmates, social workers, and volunteers came together, united by the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. The building stood in Miami, its entrance decorated with murals painted by artists who had once been incarcerated. The largest mural showed Amara surrounded by golden light, her arms open as if embracing everyone who walked through the doors. On the 10th anniversary of her mother's death, Hope held a memorial event at the foundation. Hundreds gathered, lawmakers, activists, families, and women whose lives had been changed because of Amara's legacy. As Hope stood before them, she felt a calm strength rise within her. She spoke about forgiveness, healing, and how pain could become purpose if one refused to give up. Her final words echoed through the room, "My mother was silenced once, but today, her voice belongs to all of us." The crowd rose in quiet applause, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. That night, when the lights dimmed and the guests left, Hope stepped outside into the warm Florida air. The sky was clear, and she looked up, imagining her mother's face among the stars. She smiled, knowing that even though Amara's life had ended in tragedy, her spirit had found a way to live forever, through truth, through courage, and through the unstoppable power of hope.